Have you ever thought you did something because you truly had a choice, or do you think there's a chance you might be mistaken? Let's explore this together, and if you choose to subscribe or like this video, well, did I just say you chose? Section 1: Deterministic Universe. In a deterministic universe, every event has a cause, and every cause produces a predictable effect. At first glance, this seems simple. Something happens, and something else follows. But when we apply this logic to human decisions, the picture becomes far more complex. We often believe that we stand outside this chain of causes and effects, making independent choices through some inner freedom. Yet all available evidence suggests that our decisions are not autonomous events created by an isolated self. Instead, they are the inevitable products of countless prior conditions that we did not choose and cannot escape. If we imagine the universe as a long, unbroken sequence of events stretching from the beginning of time to this very moment, then every action you take today is part of that chain. Your decision to speak, to move, to pick one option over another, did not appear out of nowhere. It arose from the structure of your brain, the chemistry of your body, the memory of everything you have lived, and even the physical state of the universe surrounding you. In this framework, your choice is not a fresh creation, but the visible tip of an enormous iceberg of causes. Think of something as simple as reaching for a glass of water. You might say you chose to pick it up because you were thirsty, but thirst itself is not your creation. It is the biological result of fluid levels in your body, chemical signals in your brain, and natural survival mechanisms shaped by evolution. Even the timing of your desire, the hand you chose to use, and the speed of the movement are all determined by internal processes that operate without your conscious involvement. You experience the action as a personal decision, but the cause of that decision is rooted in mechanisms you do not control. This becomes even more evident when we consider how sensitive human behavior is to small changes in external conditions. A shift in light, a sudden sound, a memory triggered by a smell, a word spoken by someone nearby, all these factors can alter what feels like an independent choice. You do not decide which sensory inputs reach you, nor do you decide how your brain reacts to them. They simply occur, and you react. The reaction feels intentional, but the ingredients that create it were already in place before you became aware of them. Determinism does not suggest that humans are robots or that we behave mechanically in every situation. Instead, it proposes that all behaviors, no matter how complex, emerge from the interaction of known and unknown causes, biological, psychological, and environmental. Just as a river flows according to gravity, terrain, and water pressure, a human decision flows according to neural activity, memories, hormones, and external stimuli. The river does not choose its path. It simply follows the conditions that exist. Likewise, the mind follows the conditions that shape it. When we examine decisions scientifically, we find no moment where the chain of cause and effect breaks and pure freedom appears. Every thought has a precursor. Every impulse has a source. Every conclusion you draw is influenced by prior experiences, implicit beliefs, emotional states, and neural patterns established long before you consider the decision consciously. In this sense, the idea of a completely free self standing outside causality is an illusion created by the mind's tendency to simplify reality. You feel like the author of your actions because your brain presents the final outcome to your consciousness without revealing the countless invisible steps that produced it. In a deterministic universe, the question is not whether choices exist, but whether those choices originate from a free agent. And the answer appears to be no. Choices exist, but the chooser, the conscious I, is not the source of them. The universe is a chain of events unfolding according to laws we did not design. We are part of that chain, not outside it. Section 2. The brain decides before we do. For centuries, humans believed that conscious intention was the engine of action. We assumed that we first think, then decide, and finally act. But modern neuroscience has revealed something radically different. The brain initiates decisions long before we become aware of them. In other words, what we experience as a deliberate, conscious choice is actually the final echo of a process that started without our permission and without our knowledge. This idea became famous through the experiments of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s. Libet measured electrical signals in the brain called the readiness potential. What he discovered was astonishing. The brain began preparing movement nearly full second before participants reported deciding to act. The conscious decision came after the unconscious brain activity, not before. This finding has been replicated and expanded by modern technologies such as fMRI, EIEG, and machine learning algorithms. Some studies can now predict a person's decision up to 7 or even 10 seconds before the person becomes aware of choosing. This challenges our everyday experience. When you decide to stand up, eat, speak, or choose between options, you feel as though you are the origin of that action. But the evidence suggests that consciousness is more like a narrator, explaining actions that the brain has already set in motion. The brain acts first. Consciousness offers an explanation later. This sequence gives the powerful illusion of control, even though the real control lies in processes outside awareness. The unconscious brain is constantly evaluating information, body needs, sensory input, emotions, memories, environmental cues, and countless background processes that never reach conscious awareness. These factors combine to produce impulses and decisions automatically. Only afterwards does the conscious mind notice a decision and claim authorship. This timing creates a misleading narrative. I chose this, but the truth is that the choice had already begun forming deep in the brain's neural circuits before the conscious I emerged to justify it. Consider the experience of suddenly remembering something or having an idea pop into your mind. You did not choose to think it. It appeared spontaneously. The same mechanism governs decisions. We do not consciously generate the thoughts that lead to a decision, nor do we determine the moment those thoughts arise. If you cannot choose your thoughts, how can you choose the actions that result from them? Another example comes from situations where people act without understanding why. When asked to explain their behavior, they often provide reasons that sound rational but have little to do with the actual cause. This phenomenon, known as confabulation, shows that the conscious mind is not a decision maker, but a storyteller. It receives the outcome and invents a narrative that preserves the illusion of agency. Furthermore, the unconscious brain reacts far faster than the conscious mind. It detects threats, interprets expressions, and forms judgments before conscious awareness even has time to process the information. Many experiments show that people make choices based on unconscious biases or priming, only to rationalize those choices afterward. This lag between activity and awareness reveals that the conscious mind is not steering the process, it is observing and explaining it. If the brain decides before we do, then the we who takes credit for decisions is not the true origin of them. The conscious self is more like the tip of a vast, invisible iceberg. It sees the final result, but not the forces beneath the surface that generated it. Decisions feel voluntary because the conscious mind is the last to know, not the first to act. This understanding dismantles the idea of free will. If our intentions arise from neural processes we do not control, then our choices are not truly ours. They are the predictable consequences of brain activity shaped by genetics, experience, biology, and the environment. Consciousness simply witnesses the outcome and claims ownership. When we recognize that the brain decides before we do, the illusion of free will becomes clearer. The sense of being the author of our actions is a story told after the fact. The real decision-making happens in the hidden depths of the brain long before the conscious self appears on the scene. Section 3. Environmental and genetic determinants. Human behavior feels personal, intentional, and self-generated. Yet, when we examine what shapes our decisions at the deepest level, we see that they arise from conditions we did not choose. Our genetics, our biological makeup, our upbringing, and the environment that surrounds us. These factors do not merely influence our choices, they construct the framework that makes any particular choice possible or impossible long before we become aware of it. Genetics is one of the most powerful forces behind human preferences and tendencies. Our DNA influences temperament, impulsivity, risk-taking, patience, emotional reactivity, stress sensitivity, and even social behavior. Long before conscious thought develops, genetics has already drawn boundaries around what kind of person we can become. Two people placed in the exact same situation will not respond identically because their genetic structures predispose them toward different reactions. A genetically anxious person will evaluate danger differently than someone with a calmer biological profile. These differences are not chosen traits. They are innate starting points that shape every decision that follows. Childhood environment adds another layer of determinism. We do not choose the family we are born into, the culture that surrounds us, the beliefs we are taught, or the emotional climate we experience during our formative years. Yet, these are precisely the forces that establish our values, fears, expectations, and coping strategies. A child raised in a nurturing household develops different decision patterns from one raised in neglect or conflict. By the time we reach adulthood, countless unconscious associations have already been formed, guiding how we evaluate opportunities, relationships, threats, and rewards. These early conditions act as invisible architects of our decision-making. Social environment further narrows what we perceive as possible. Education, peer groups, economic status, and cultural norms subtly guide behavior. By defining what is acceptable, desirable, or normal, even minor environmental differences, such as the street we grew up on, the teachers we encountered, or the friends we happened to meet, shape thousands of micro decisions that accumulate into identity. None of these influences are selected by our free will. They are circumstances that imprint themselves on our minds and quietly determine how we interpret the world. Biological states play an equally crucial role. Hormone levels, sleep quality, blood sugar, and neurotransmitter fluctuations all affect judgment and behavior. A person with low serotonin will evaluate a situation differently from someone with balanced levels. A hungry brain makes different choices from a well-rested one. These physiological conditions shift continuously and automatically, yet they govern how we react at every moment. We experience the resulting behavior as my decision, even though the underlying biological forces operate independently of conscious control. Cognitive biases, which arise naturally from the structure of the human mind, further push us toward predictable patterns. Confirmation bias, loss aversion, anchoring, and dozens of other mental shortcuts lead us to consistent, automatic responses. We do not invent these biases. We inherit them as part of the human cognitive system. They determine how we interpret evidence, evaluate risks, and arrive at conclusions. Even when we believe we are thinking rationally, these unconscious patterns shape the outcome. When all this is combined, genetic predispositions, early conditioning, social context, biological fluctuations, and cognitive architecture, it becomes clear that the space in which decisions occur is tightly constrained. A person can only choose among the options their biology and environment allow them to perceive. Another person with a different set of inherited and learned conditions would make a different choice in the same moment. This means that decisions are expressions of circumstances, not independent acts of will. The idea of a freely choosing self assumes that we stand apart from these influences, but in reality, we are built by them. Every preference, fear, judgment, and impulse that contributes to a decision originates from forces outside conscious control. We are shaped long before we claim agency, and we continue to be shaped moment by moment by conditions we never selected. When decisions arise from factors we neither designed nor directed, the concept of free will loses its foundation. We feel like authors of our choices, but the blueprint is written by genetics and environment. The conscious mind witnesses the final product, without having crafted the machinery that produced it. Section 4: The Illusion of Choice. The feeling of making a choice is one of the most convincing experiences we have. It seems simple. We consider alternatives, weigh reasons, and select one option over another. Yet, this familiar sense of authorship is deeply misleading. What we call choosing is not a genuine act of independent control, but a narrative constructed by the mind after unconscious processes have already shaped the outcome. The sensation of choice is powerful, but it does not accurately represent how decisions form. When we face a decision, we believe we are examining possibilities in a neutral, open way. In reality, the range of options we can even imagine is restricted by our mental architecture. Preferences appear automatically, not because we consciously generate them, but because the brain assigns value to each option using hidden algorithms based on memory, emotional conditioning, and biological drives. Before conscious awareness enters the scene, your brain has already ranked the options and pushed you toward the one it prefers. The conscious mind becomes aware only of the final nudge and interprets it as a voluntary choice. This becomes clearer when we observe how easily choices can be manipulated by subtle cues. A product placed at eye level seems more appealing. A song playing in the background changes which items people pick in a store. The order in which options are presented affects what seems attractive. Even the wording of a question can push the mind toward a specific answer. These influences work precisely because the feeling of choosing blinds us to how heavily external factors shape the process. We think we are selecting freely, but our brain follows patterns triggered by the environment. Another aspect of the illusion appears in the timing of decisions. The conscious mind only becomes aware of a choice moment after the brain has already filtered information and formed an inclination. When a person says, "I feel like choosing this," the feeling itself is the result of prior unconscious processes. Conscious intention appears to sit at the center of decision-making, but in truth, it is positioned at the very end of the sequence. It does not initiate choices. It merely observes them and claims ownership. The mind reinforces this illusion by constructing explanations that sound thoughtful and deliberate. After making a decision, people provide reasons that justify their choice, even when those reasons were not part of the actual process. This rationalization happens automatically. The brain dislikes gaps in understanding, so it fills them with coherent stories that make the decision appear intentional. These stories are convincing because they match our self-image. We want to believe we act with purpose and independence. But the confidence we feel in these explanations does not reflect how the decision formed. It reflects how good the mind is at stitching together narratives. A more subtle layer of the illusion comes from the structure of attention. At any moment, countless thoughts, impulses, and sensations arise in the background, but only a few reach conscious awareness. We take whatever appears in our attention as the relevant choice. unaware that our mind has filtered out dozens of alternative possibilities before we even considered them. This selective spotlight creates the impression that the choices we see are the choices that exist. But the mind is not presenting a neutral canvas. It is curating options based on processes hidden from us. The conscious self picks from a list it did not create. Even moments that feel highly deliberate, long reflection, careful planning, rational debate are shaped by deeper mechanisms. Logical reasoning is influenced by emotional associations, cultural norms, and internal priorities that were not consciously selected. The sense of control we feel during rational thought is just another layer of the illusion. The content of our reasoning is influenced by unconscious biases and associations, while the direction of thought follows neural pathways forged by past experience. Choice feels real because experiencing a decision and generating a narrative about it happens seamlessly. The brain hides its internal operations and supplies only the final outcome, making the process appear simple and self-directed. But when we peel back the layers, we find no moment where a free, independent agent steps in to choose. Instead, we discover a vast network of influences, impulses, and automatic evaluations that produce the sensation of choosing without granting actual control. The illusion of choice persists not because it reflects the truth, but because it protects a coherent sense of identity. It allows us to feel stable, intentional, and responsible. Yet the existence of this feeling does not mean that free choice exists. It only shows how convincing the brain's storytelling can be. Section 5. The Conscious Self as an Observer. We tend to imagine consciousness as the command center of the mind, a place where decisions are made, motives are evaluated, and actions are launched. But modern cognitive science suggests a very different picture. The conscious self is not a commander, but an observer. It receives the results of mental processes that have already unfolded behind the scenes. Rather than steering the mind, consciousness witnesses its activity and constructs a narrative around it. To understand this role, it helps to notice how rarely we control the flow of thoughts. Ideas appear unexpectedly, memories surface without invitation, and emotions arise spontaneously. We do not select the beginning or timing of these experiences. We encounter them. Conscious awareness is like a spotlight that illuminates events already occurring within the brain, not a force that generates them. If we cannot choose the contents of thought, then we cannot claim ownership over the decisions built from those thoughts. Neuroscience reveals that the majority of mental operations occur outside conscious awareness: sensory processing, emotional evaluation, linguistic comprehension, pattern recognition, and impulse formation all happen automatically. The conscious mind gains access only to the final outputs of these operations, not to the hidden mechanisms that produced them. When we suddenly realize something, the realization is the end point of a chain of processing we never saw. This positions consciousness as the final stop on a long internal pathway, not the starting point. The observer-like nature of consciousness becomes even clearer in moments of rapid action. When catching a falling object, swerving while driving, or reacting to sudden danger, the body responds instantly. Conscious awareness often arrives only after the movement is already underway. These reactions show that the brain can initiate behavior entirely on its own without consulting the conscious self. The observer only notices what happened and attributes purpose after the fact. Another clue lies in habits and automatic skills. Once we learn to type, drive, or play an instrument, the actions unfold with minimal conscious involvement. Conscious effort actually disrupts performance. This indicates that expertise relies on systems outside awareness. The conscious self claims ownership of these skills, but contributes very little to their execution. It is similar to watching a well-rehearsed performance rather than directing it. The sense of being an independent agent also weakens when we consider how consciousness interacts with emotions. Feelings arise without permission, shift unpredictably, and fade without agreement. They influence preference, motivation, and behavior long before the conscious self tries to interpret them. Consciousness does not decide which emotions appear. It explains them. It is more of a commentator than a creator. Language further illustrates the observer role. We often hear ourselves think as if listening to an internal narrator. But this narration is not something consciousness constructs deliberately. It emerges automatically from neural processes. Consciousness listens to its own thoughts as though they were spoken by someone else, demonstrating that it does not craft the message, but receives it. Even self-reflection, which feels deeply intentional, depends on unconscious patterns. The questions we ask ourselves, the insights that surface, and the interpretations we form are shaped by associations we did not consciously design. Conscious reasoning rides on top of unconscious groundwork. The self that observes these reflections is not directing the machinery, but interpreting its results. Because consciousness is positioned at the end of mental processes, it creates the illusion of centrality. We assume that awareness equals control, but awareness is simply the final interface, the part where we experience the outcome. The true engines of behavior operate below the surface, silently generating impulses and preferences, evaluations, and conclusions. The conscious self notices these products and weaves them into a coherent personal story. When we see consciousness for what it is, a witness rather than a driver, the concept of free will becomes difficult to sustain. If the conscious mind does not produce thoughts, initiate decisions, or regulate emotional states, then it cannot be the source of autonomous choice. It plays the role of an interpreter, not an originator. The observer self feels central, because it is the part of the mind that experiences everything. But experiencing is not creating. The machinery runs on its own, and consciousness is the window through which the results become visible. This understanding reshapes our idea of agency. We are not the authors of our mental lives, but the audience watching them unfold. Section 6: Consequences of Living Without Free Will. If our decisions arise from unconscious processes rather than autonomous choice, the implications reach far beyond theory. A life without free will reshapes our understanding of responsibility, identity, and moral judgment. Instead of seeing ourselves as self-directed originators, we begin to view human behavior as the product of complex internal and external conditions. This shift challenges long-held assumptions, but it also offers a clearer and more accurate framework for understanding human actions. One major consequence is a transformation in how we interpret personal success and failure. Achievements are traditionally viewed as proof of determination, discipline, and deliberate effort. Yet, if decisions are driven by prior causes, then success reflects a convergence of influences: supportive environments, biological advantages, psychological resilience, and chance. Similarly, failures are not evidence of laziness or weak character, but outcomes shaped by circumstances, genetic predispositions, social pressures, emotional patterns, and limited resources. Recognizing this does not diminish effort. It reframes it as the result of conditions rather than an expression of uncaused will. This perspective also alters our approach to judgment. If individuals do not freely choose their impulses, values, or reactions, then moral anger becomes harder to justify. Wrongful actions still require consequences for protection and rehabilitation, but blame becomes less about moral condemnation and more about understanding causation. Instead of viewing harmful behavior as the product of an independently choosing self, we see it as the outcome of psychological states shaped by biology, upbringing, trauma, and environment. This mindset allows for more constructive responses, prioritizing treatment, education, and social reform rather than relying solely on punishment. A world without free will also deepens empathy. When we recognize that people cannot select their fears, motivations, or emotional responses, compassion becomes more intuitive. It becomes easier to see others' suffering as unchosen and their mistakes as the product of conditions they did not control. Rather than attributing behaviors to character flaws, we examine the forces shaping them. This does not excuse harmful actions, but it fosters a more realistic and humane view of human behavior. Another consequence concerns identity. If our thoughts and preferences emerge from unconscious mechanisms, then the idea of a stable, autonomous self becomes less concrete. Instead of a single director behind our actions, we find a collection of processes, memories, impulses, biases, and learned tendencies that produce the experience of being someone. Identity becomes a dynamic pattern rather than a freely chosen essence. This can be unsettling, but it can also reduce self-blame and soften rigid self-concepts. People gain permission to change because they realize their current patterns are not fixed expressions of will, but malleable outcomes of experience. Motivation is often assumed to depend on free will, but this assumption is mistaken. Even without autonomous choice, goals and ambitions continue to arise as products of desires, environmental cues, and psychological needs. We pursue what matters to us not because we independently decide to care, but because caring emerges from the machinery of the mind. Removing free will does not remove action. It removes the illusion that action begins from an uncaused source. People still strive, improve, and commit to long-term projects, driven by internal states they did not consciously design. Without free will, our understanding of social systems also changes. Inequality, violence, addiction, and discrimination become less about individual shortcomings and more about structural conditions that shape human behavior. Solutions shift from blaming individuals to addressing the underlying causes: education, opportunity, mental health support, and safe environments. This approach is not only more compassionate, but also more effective, because it targets the roots of behavior rather than its symptoms. Perhaps the most profound consequence is psychological relief. The absence of free will removes the burden of believing we must control every thought, emotion, and decision. Instead of seeing ourselves as failing when we struggle, we recognize that the struggle itself is part of a causal chain we did not select. This understanding encourages acceptance, not passive resignation, but clarity about why the mind behaves as it does. With acceptance comes the ability to work with our tendencies rather than against them. In the end, the absence of free will does not strip life of meaning. It redirects meaning toward understanding, compassion, and insight. We do not become powerless. We simply recognize that power emerges from conditions, and that by changing conditions, we can change outcomes. A world without free will is not a world without growth, morality, or purpose. It is a world where these concepts are rooted in reality, not illusion. Since we now understand that we are not truly free, consider what rules should do, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe.